The early morning mist still clung to the streets of Boston as Marcus Thompson made his way down Beacon Street, his leather briefcase swinging gently at his side. At 43, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years navigating complex situations, though few who passed him on the street would have guessed the nature of his work. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his morning routine as predictable as the sunrise over the Charles River. Officer Derek Sullivan had been patrolling this neighborhood for 15 years, long enough to believe he could spot trouble from 3 blocks away. His squad car idled at the corner of Charles and Beacon, the heater fighting against the November chill as he sipped his third coffee of the morning. Sullivan prided himself on what he called his instincts, though others might have used different words to describe his tendency to see threats where none existed. As Marcus approached the intersection, his phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. He paused to check it, standing beneath the amber glow of a streetlight that hadn't yet switched off in the dawn light. The message was brief but urgent. "Remember, the Morrison files need your review before the 9 a.m. meeting." Marcus typed a quick response, completely unaware that this simple act of stopping to use his phone would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of Boston's legal establishment. Sullivan's eyes narrowed as he watched the well-dressed black man pause on the corner. In his mind, the expensive suit and briefcase didn't register as signs of professional success, but as potential indicators of something more sinister. Perhaps this was someone casing the upscale brownstones, or worse, someone who had already committed a crime and was trying to blend in. The officer's hand instinctively moved to his radio as he made a decision that would soon haunt him. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247. I've got a suspicious individual at Charles and Beacon, African-American male, early 40s, wearing a dark suit, requesting backup for a potential stop and question." The radio crackled with acknowledgement, and Sullivan felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with what he perceived as good police work. Marcus finished his text and continued walking, his mind already on the day ahead. The Morrison case was particularly complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and enough legal precedent to fill a small library. He was so absorbed in mentally preparing his arguments that he barely noticed the police cruiser pulling alongside him until the officer's voice cut through his thoughts. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." Sullivan had exited his vehicle, one hand resting on his holstered weapon, the other pointing directly at Marcus. Marcus turned, genuinely surprised to find himself being addressed. He glanced around, wondering if perhaps the officer was speaking to someone else, but the empty sidewalk confirmed he was indeed the target of this attention. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Sullivan's jaw tightened at what he perceived as an overly casual response. In his experience, innocent people showed more deference, more immediate compliance. "I need to see some identification. What's your business in this neighborhood?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Marcus had encountered too many times before. He kept his voice level, professional, even as a familiar weariness settled over him. "I work in this neighborhood, officer. I'm on my way to my office." "At 6 in the morning?" Sullivan's skepticism was palpable. "Pretty early to be heading to work. Mind telling me what kind of work has you out here at this hour?" Marcus felt his patience beginning to fray, but years of experience had taught him the importance of maintaining composure in these situations. "I often start early. May I ask what this is about? Have I violated any laws?" The arrival of a second patrol car interrupted their exchange. Officer Patricia Martinez stepped out, her hand automatically checking her equipment belt as she approached. She had been Sullivan's occasional partner for 3 years, and while she respected his experience, she had also noticed his tendency to see threats where none existed, particularly when it came to people of color. "What's the situation, Derek?" Martinez asked, her eyes moving between Sullivan and Marcus. taking in the businessman's professional appearance and calm demeanor. Found him loitering near the corner, checking his phone, looking at the buildings. Says he works around here, but something doesn't add up. Sullivan's voice carried the certainty of someone who had already made up his mind. Marcus reached slowly for his wallet, careful to telegraph every movement. "Officers, I'm happy to show you my identification. I'm Marcus Thompson. I work at the courthouse." As he extracted his driver's license, Sullivan's eyes caught something else in the wallet, a glimpse of another form of identification that made him even more suspicious. "What's that other ID? Let me see all of them." The situation was escalating in a way that felt sickeningly familiar to Marcus. He had seen this play out countless times, not just in his personal experience, but in the cases that crossed his desk. The pattern was always the same: suspicion based on appearance, questions designed to provoke rather than investigate, and an escalation that seemed almost predetermined. "Officer Sullivan," Marcus read the name tag. "I'm going to reach for my work identification now. I want to be very clear about my movements." He slowly pulled out his courthouse ID badge, the one that usually commanded immediate respect and deference. But Sullivan barely glanced at it. His mind had already constructed a narrative, and mere facts weren't going to disrupt it. "Anyone can fake an ID. You're going to need to come with us to the station. We'll sort this out there." Martinez shifted uncomfortably. Something about this felt wrong, but challenging a senior officer on the street wasn't protocol. She looked more carefully at the ID Marcus was holding, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face, followed quickly by concern. "Derek," she said quietly, "maybe we should—" "I've got this, Martinez," Sullivan cut her off. His voice had taken on an edge that brooked no argument. He turned back to Marcus. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." The morning commuters were beginning to fill the sidewalks now, and several people slowed to watch the scene unfolding. Marcus noticed a few pulling out their phones, whether to call for help or to record what was happening. He couldn't tell. He found himself at a crossroads that he had helped others navigate countless times in his career, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. "Officer Sullivan, I must respectfully decline to be arrested without cause. I've committed no crime. I provided identification, and I've been cooperative throughout this encounter. I know my rights, and I know that—" "Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order?" Sullivan's hand moved to his handcuffs, his voice rising. "That's resisting arrest." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Marcus. Here he was, someone who had dedicated his life to ensuring justice was served fairly and impartially, being subjected to the very kind of arbitrary treatment he worked to prevent. But he also knew that pointing out this irony now would only escalate the situation further. Martinez stepped forward, trying once more to defuse the situation. "Derek, I really think we should call this in first. Check with dispatch about—" "I said I've got this," Sullivan snapped, his face reddening. He had committed too far to back down now, his ego and his version of events too entrenched to allow for any other possibility. "Sir, this is your last warning. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Marcus made a decision in that moment, one that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. He turned around slowly, placing his briefcase on the ground with deliberate care. As Sullivan approached with the handcuffs, Marcus spoke clearly and calmly, loud enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear. "Officer Sullivan, I am complying under protest. I have committed no crime, and this arrest is without probable cause. I want it noted that Officer Martinez appears to have reservations about this action." He paused as the cold metal clicked around his wrists. "And for the record, you should know that I am—" "Save it for the judge," Sullivan interrupted, the satisfaction in his voice unmistakable. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how quickly his satisfaction would turn to horror. As they led Marcus to the patrol car, Martinez caught another glimpse of his courthouse ID, and this time she saw the full text. Her eyes widened, and she grabbed Sullivan's arm. "Derek, wait. You need to see this. You need to see who he is." But Sullivan was already putting Marcus in the back of the cruiser, too caught up in his own narrative to listen. "We'll sort it all out at the station. That's what we do with suspicious individuals who can't properly account for themselves." The drive to the precinct was silent, except for the static-filled chatter of the police radio. Marcus sat in the back, his mind already working through the legal implications of what had just occurred. He wasn't just thinking about his own situation, but about how this incident could be used to highlight the systemic issues that allowed such things to happen. Meanwhile, Martinez followed in her patrol car, her stomach churning with the growing certainty that they had just made a catastrophic mistake. She had tried to warn Sullivan, but his stubbornness and prejudice had overridden any chance of a reasonable resolution. Now, as she followed the lead car through the morning traffic, she found herself hoping that somehow this could be resolved quietly at the station. But quiet resolutions were not in the cards that day. What awaited them at the courthouse would not only shock everyone involved, but would send ripples through the entire Boston legal system. Because Officer Sullivan had just arrested Judge Marcus Thompson, the newly appointed Chief Judge of the Massachusetts Superior Court, and the man responsible for overseeing police misconduct cases throughout the state. The fluorescent lights of the Boston Police Department's District C6 station cast an unflattering glow on the processing area as Officer Sullivan guided Marcus Thompson through the familiar steps of booking. The morning shift had just begun and the station buzzed with the controlled chaos of officers preparing for their day, oblivious to the drama about to unfold in their midst. Sullivan's confidence remained unshaken as he removed the handcuffs from Marcus, gesturing toward the metal chair beside the booking desk. "Have a seat. This won't take long." His tone carried the casual authority of someone who had done this countless times before, never once considering that this particular arrest might be different from all the others. Marcus sat down carefully, his expression remaining composed despite the indignity of the situation. Years of presiding over cases had taught him the value of patience and observation. He noticed the duty sergeant behind the desk, a veteran officer named Patricia O'Malley, whose reputation for thoroughness was well known throughout the Boston legal community, though she wouldn't have recognized him out of his judicial robes. "Morning, Sully," O'Malley greeted without looking up from her paperwork. "What do we have here?" "Suspicious person, possible burglary suspect," Sullivan replied, pulling out his notepad. "Found him on Beacon Street, acting strange, couldn't properly explain what he was doing in the neighborhood at that hour." O'Malley finally glanced up, her experienced eyes taking in Marcus's expensive suit and calm demeanor. Something about the situation struck her as odd, but she'd learned long ago not to second-guess arresting officers without cause. "Name?" "Marcus Thompson," Sullivan answered before Marcus could speak. "Claims he works at the courthouse." The sergeant's pen paused mid-stroke. "Claims?" She looked directly at Marcus now, something flickering in her expression. "Sir, what exactly do you do at the courthouse?" Before Marcus could answer, Officer Martinez burst through the processing room doors, slightly out of breath and clutching a folder. "Sergeant O'Malley, I need to speak with you immediately. It's about this arrest." Sullivan's jaw tightened. "Martinez, what are you doing? We agreed I'd handle the booking." "No, Derek. You said you'd handle it." "I never agreed." Martinez's voice carried an edge of urgency that made several nearby officers look up from their work. "Sergeant, you need to see this documentation right now." O'Malley's eyebrows rose at the unusual interruption. In her 23 years on the force, she'd rarely seen such obvious tension between partners over a routine booking. "Officer Martinez, what exactly is the issue?" Martinez stepped forward, opening the folder to reveal a printout from the Massachusetts court system website. This is Marcus Thompson's official biography from the court's website. He's not just someone who works at the courthouse, That's enough, Martinez, Sullivan snapped, his face flushing. We don't verify every suspect's story by Googling them. We follow procedure. But O'Malley was already scanning the document, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern to something approaching alarm. She looked up at Marcus, then back at the paper, then at Sullivan. Officer Sullivan, did you actually look at this man's identification? Of course I did. He had a courthouse ID, probably fake. Anyone can make those these days. Sullivan's defensiveness was becoming more pronounced with each exchange. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in his courtroom. Sergeant O'Malley, I believe Officer Martinez is trying to inform you that I am Judge Marcus Thompson, Chief Judge of the Massachusetts Superior Court. I was appointed to the position 3 months ago. The words landed in the room like a physical force. Several nearby officers stopped what they were doing, turning to stare. Sullivan's face went through a rapid series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, and finally the beginning of horrified realization. That's impossible, Sullivan stammered. You can't be... O'Malley was already reaching for her desk phone. Captain Rodriguez, we need you in booking immediately. We have a situation. She listened for a moment, then added, Yes, sir, right away. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. What had been routine background noise, keyboards clicking, radio chatter, casual conversation, had fallen to near silence. Every officer within earshot was now paying attention to the unfolding drama. Martinez moved closer to Sullivan, speaking in a low, urgent voice. I tried to tell you, Derek, I recognized him from the ceremony last month. Remember, we did security for his investiture. Sullivan's mind was clearly racing, trying to reconcile his assumptions with this new reality. But he didn't say... Why didn't he just tell me who he was? I attempted to, Officer Sullivan, Marcus replied calmly. You interrupted me and told me to save it for the judge. I found that particularly ironic, given the circumstances. Captain Elena Rodriguez entered the booking area with quick, purposeful strides. A 25-year veteran known for her no-nonsense approach to police work, she took in the scene with experienced eyes, Sullivan's pale face, Martinez's obvious distress, O'Malley's concerned expression, and the well-dressed man sitting calmly in the booking chair. Someone want to explain what's going on here? Rodriguez's voice cut through the tension like a blade. O'Malley stood, handing the captain the printout. Ma'am, Officer Sullivan arrested Judge Marcus Thompson this morning, the Chief Judge of the Superior Court. Rodriguez's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as she scanned the document. She looked at Marcus, recognition dawning. Judge Thompson, I am so sorry. I attended your investiture ceremony. She turned to Sullivan, her expression hardening. Officer Sullivan, my office now. Captain, I can explain, Sullivan began, but Rodriguez cut him off with a sharp gesture. Not here, my office. She turned back to Marcus, her demeanor shifting to one of professional contrition. Judge Thompson, please accept my sincere apologies. This is obviously a terrible misunderstanding. Can I offer you some coffee while we sort this out? Marcus stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. Thank you, Captain Rodriguez. I appreciate your courtesy. However, I don't think this is merely a misunderstanding. I believe this incident represents a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. The captain's face showed she understood exactly what he meant. Of course, Your Honor. Would you prefer to discuss this in my office, or would you like to file a formal complaint? Both, I think, Marcus replied. But first, I'd like to understand Officer Sullivan's reasoning for this arrest. Not in private, but here, where his colleagues can hear it. I believe this could be a teaching moment for everyone." Sullivan looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning horror of someone realizing the magnitude of their mistake. "Your Honor, I was just doing my job. You were in an affluent neighborhood early in the morning and I was black." Marcus finished for him. "That's really what this comes down to, isn't it? Despite my professional attire, despite my cooperation, despite showing you legitimate identification, you saw my skin color first and made assumptions based on that." The silence in the room was absolute. Every officer present knew they were witnessing something significant, something that would be talked about in the department for years to come. Martinez stepped forward. "Your Honor, I want to apologize as well. I should have been more forceful in my objections. I recognized you, but I didn't push hard enough to stop this from happening." Marcus nodded acknowledgement. "Officer Martinez, I appreciate your honesty. The fact that you tried to intervene speaks well of you. The question is, why didn't your intervention carry more weight with your senior partner?" Captain Rodriguez was clearly trying to manage what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. "Judge Thompson, perhaps we could continue this discussion in private. I assure you, we take these matters very seriously, and there will be a full investigation." "With all due respect, Captain, that's exactly the problem," Marcus replied, his judicial bearing now fully evident despite his disheveled appearance from the arrest. "These matters are always handled privately, quietly, away from the rank and file who might actually learn something from them. How many Officer Sullivans are out there right now, making the same assumptions, acting on the same biases?" O'Malley spoke up, surprising everyone. "He's right, Captain. I've been on this job 23 years, and I've seen this pattern too many times. Maybe it's time we had this conversation out in the open." Rodriguez looked around the room, taking in the attentive faces of her officers. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful, and a few were nodding in agreement with O'Malley's words. She made a decision that would later be recognized as a turning point in the department's approach to bias training. "All right, Judge Thompson, you want transparency? Let's have it. Officer Sullivan, explain your probable cause for this arrest. And I want every officer in this room to listen carefully, because we're going to use this as a case study in our next training session." Sullivan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "I observed the individual, standing on a street corner in Beacon Hill at approximately 6:15 a.m. He was using a cell phone and appeared to be observing the surrounding buildings." "And that constitutes suspicious behavior?" Marcus asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "In that neighborhood at that hour?" Sullivan trailed off, realizing how weak his reasoning sounded when stated aloud. "Officer Sullivan, do you patrol that area regularly?" Marcus continued his gentle interrogation. "Yes, Your Honor. 5 days a week for the past 15 years. And in those 15 years, how many white individuals have you stopped for similar behavior, standing on a street corner using a phone, in business attire?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sullivan's face reddened further, but he didn't answer. "Let me rephrase," Marcus said. "How many white attorneys or judges have you stopped on their way to work?" "None, Your Honor," Sullivan whispered, "and yet you felt compelled to stop me. Can you explain why?" Sullivan looked desperately at Captain Rodriguez, but found no rescue there. The captain's expression made it clear she expected an answer. I thought you didn't belong there," Sullivan finally admitted, the words barely audible. "Based on what, exactly?" Marcus pressed gently. "Based on how you looked." The admission seemed to deflate Sullivan completely. He stood there, shoulders slumped, forced to confront the reality of his own biases in front of his colleagues. Marcus turned to address the room at large. "Officers, I want you to understand something. Officer Sullivan isn't uniquely biased. He's a product of a system that has, for too long, operated on assumptions rather than evidence. The fact that I happen to be a judge doesn't make this arrest more wrong than if I were a teacher, a doctor, or an unemployed person just taking a morning walk." Several officers nodded, while others shifted uncomfortably. The morning shift briefing had turned into something none of them had expected when they reported for duty. "The question we all need to ask ourselves," Marcus continued, "is how many people have been subjected to this same treatment who didn't have the protection of a judicial title? How many cases have been built on nothing more than an officer's assumption about who belongs and who doesn't?" Captain Rodriguez stepped forward. "Judge Thompson, you've given us a lot to think about. I can promise you this incident will not be swept under the rug. We'll be conducting a thorough review of our stop and identify procedures, and Officer Sullivan will face appropriate disciplinary action." "I appreciate that, Captain," Marcus replied. "But I'm less interested in punishing Officer Sullivan than I am in preventing the next Officer Sullivan from making the same mistakes. This is about education, not retribution." Martinez spoke up again. "Your Honor, what would you suggest we do differently?" Marcus smiled slightly, the first break in his serious demeanor. "That's exactly the right question, Officer Martinez, and I think the answer starts with having more conversations like this one where we acknowledge our biases and work actively to counter them, where we question our assumptions before we act on them." The room fell into thoughtful silence. Even Sullivan, despite his humiliation, seemed to be listening intently. "I'll tell you what," Marcus continued. "I'm going to make you all a deal. Instead of filing a formal complaint, I'm going to work with Captain Rodriguez to develop a new training program, one that uses this incident as a case study. Officer Sullivan, I'm going to need your participation. Are you willing?" Sullivan looked up, surprise evident on his face. "Your Honor, you want me to help? I want you to be honest about what you were thinking and feeling. I want other officers to understand how easy it is to let assumptions guide our actions. Most importantly, I want you to help your colleagues avoid making the same mistakes." The offer hung in the air like an extended hand. Sullivan looked at his captain, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Your Honor, I'll help however I can." Word of the incident spread through the Boston legal community like wildfire. By noon, every courthouse, law office, and legal aid clinic in the city was buzzing with the news that Judge Marcus Thompson had been arrested during his morning commute. The story took on different shades depending on who was telling it, but the core fact remained unchanged. The newly appointed chief judge of the Superior Court had been handcuffed and taken into custody for the crime of being black in an affluent neighborhood. In his chambers at the Suffolk County Courthouse, Judge Harold Weinstein received the news from his clerk with genuine disbelief. Weinstein, who had served on the bench for 32 years and had seen his share of judicial controversies, immediately called Thompson's office. When he learned that the judge had not yet arrived and why, his usual measured demeanor gave way to rare anger. "This is absolutely unconscionable," he declared to his staff. "Judge Thompson is one of the most respected legal minds in the Commonwealth. That this could happen to him, of all people." He trailed off, the implications hanging heavy in the air. Meanwhile, in the district attorney's office across town, DA Michelle Chen was conducting her own damage control operation. As the city's first Asian American district attorney, she understood all too well the challenges faced by minorities in positions of authority. Her phone had been ringing non-stop since word got out, with reporters, civil rights organizations, and concerned citizens, all demanding to know what her office intended to do about the incident. "We need to handle this very carefully," she told her senior staff during an emergency meeting. "This isn't just about one wrongful arrest. This is about the integrity of our entire justice system. If a sitting judge can be profiled and arrested without cause, what message does that send to the community we're supposed to serve? Back at the police station, Marcus Thompson sat in Captain Rodriguez's office, having politely declined her repeated offers to have him driven to the courthouse. He was engaged in what had become an impromptu educational session with a growing number of officers who had asked to sit in on the discussion. The thing about implicit bias, Marcus was explaining to the assembled officers, is that it's not always conscious. Officer Sullivan didn't wake up this morning thinking, "I'm going to arrest a black judge today." But somewhere in his mind there was a program running that said black man in expensive neighborhood equals suspicious. That's what we need to address. Sullivan, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up. "Your Honor, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about how many white people I've stopped for similar behavior. The truth is, I've seen plenty of white folks on their phones early in the morning in that neighborhood. Partners at law firms, doctors heading to the hospital, joggers checking their routes. I never gave them a second glance." The admission seemed to cost him something, but it also appeared to lift a weight from his shoulders. The other officers in the room exchanged meaningful looks. Captain Rodriguez's phone rang and she excused herself to answer it. When she returned, her expression was grim. "Judge Thompson, that was the mayor's office. The press has gotten wind of the story. There are news vans setting up outside the station as we speak." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I expected this would become public. The question is, how do we use this attention constructively?" "With respect, Your Honor," Rodriguez replied, "my immediate concern is getting you out of here without turning this into more of a media circus than it already is." "Captain, I appreciate your concern, but I think we're looking at this backwards. This is an opportunity to demonstrate transparency and accountability. Instead of sneaking out the back door, let's address this head-on." The suggestion clearly made Rodriguez uncomfortable, but she could see the wisdom in it. "What did you have in mind?" "A joint press conference," Marcus replied. "You, me, and Officer Sullivan. We acknowledge what happened, we take responsibility, and we outline concrete steps for preventing similar incidents in the future." Sullivan's head snapped up. "Your Honor, you want me to speak to the press?" "I want you to own your mistake, Officer Sullivan. Not as punishment, but as an example of how we learn and grow from our errors. The public needs to see that police officers are capable of admitting when they're wrong." The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. It was an unconventional approach, to say the least. Police departments typically handled such matters through carefully worded press releases and internal investigations conducted far from public view. "It's risky," Rodriguez admitted, "but it might be exactly what we need. Officer Sullivan, are you willing to do this?" Sullivan looked terrified but nodded slowly. "If Judge Thompson thinks it will help, yes, ma'am." An hour later, the three of them stood before a forest of microphones and cameras outside the police station. The assembled media represented every major outlet in Boston and several national networks. Marcus had changed into a fresh shirt provided by one of the officers, but he had deliberately kept his slightly rumpled appearance to underscore the reality of what had occurred. Captain Rodriguez spoke first, reading from a prepared statement. "This morning, one of our officers made an error in judgment that resulted in the wrongful arrest of Judge Marcus Thompson. We take full responsibility for this incident and are committed to using it as a catalyst for meaningful change in our department." When it was Sullivan's turn to speak, his voice shook slightly but grew stronger as he continued. "I made assumptions based on appearance rather than behavior or evidence. I failed to live up to the standards we set for ourselves as police officers. I apologize to Judge Thompson and to the community we serve. I'm committed to learning from this mistake and helping my fellow officers avoid similar errors." The cameras clicked and whirred as Marcus stepped forward. His presence commanded attention, even without his judicial robes. What happened to me this morning happens to countless individuals across our city, our state, and our nation. The difference is that my position affords me a platform to address it. Officer Sullivan's willingness to acknowledge his mistake publicly is commendable, but individual accountability isn't enough. We need systemic change. A reporter from the Globe raised her hand. Judge Thompson, will you be filing a civil suit against the department? No, Marcus replied firmly. Litigation would only serve to create adversarial positions when what we need is collaboration. Instead, I'll be working with Captain Rodriguez and her team to develop comprehensive bias training that will be mandatory for all officers. Another reporter jumped in. Officer Sullivan, do you believe you're racist? The question hung in the air like a live wire. Sullivan glanced at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. I don't think of myself as racist, Sullivan said carefully, but today I learned that you don't have to be wearing a hood to act on racial prejudice. Good intentions aren't enough if your actions cause harm. The press conference continued for another 20 minutes with questions ranging from the specific details of the arrest to broader issues of racial profiling in law enforcement. Throughout it all, Marcus maintained his composed demeanor, turning each question into an opportunity for education rather than condemnation. When it was over, as the media began to disperse, an elderly black woman approached Marcus. She had been standing at the back of the crowd, watching silently. Judge Thompson, she said, her voice carrying the weight of years. I'm Ethel Washington. My grandson was stopped by police last month in the same neighborhood. He's a medical student at Harvard, but they didn't care about that. They just saw a young black man and assumed the worst. Marcus took her hand gently. What happened to your grandson, Mrs. Washington? They let him go eventually, after making him sit on the curb for 40 minutes while they verified his story. He was late for his rotation at Mass General. His supervisor wrote him up. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. He called me that night, asking if maybe he should start dressing differently, acting differently. I didn't know what to tell him. Tell him to keep being himself, Marcus said firmly. Tell him that what happened today is a step toward making sure he won't have to change who he is to feel safe in his own city. The exchange was overheard by several reporters who had lingered, and within hours, Ethel Washington's story was being shared alongside coverage of Marcus's arrest. It personalized the issue in a way that statistics never could, putting faces to the abstract concept of racial profiling. That evening, as Marcus finally made his way to his chambers at the courthouse, he found his voicemail full and his email overflowing. Messages from fellow judges, civil rights organizations, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had experienced similar treatment. The incident had clearly struck a nerve. His secretary, Gladys Freeman, who had worked with 5 chief judges before him, was waiting with a cup of tea and a knowing look. Quite a first day at work, Your Honor. Marcus smiled wearily. Not exactly how I planned to make my mark on the justice system, Gladys. Maybe not, she replied, but sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. The question is, what are you going to do with this opportunity? Over the next several days, the incident continued to reverberate through Boston's institutions. The city council called for hearings on police practices. The Bar Association organized a symposium on implicit bias in the justice system. Law schools across the state began incorporating the case into their curricula as a real-world example of constitutional issues in action. But it was in the police department itself that the most significant changes began to take shape. Captain Rodriguez, true to her word, instituted immediate reforms. Roll call briefings now included daily discussions of bias awareness. Officers were required to document not just whom they stopped, but why, creating a paper trail that could be analyzed for patterns of discrimination. Officer Sullivan, rather than being ostracized by his colleagues as he had feared, found himself at the center of a transformation. Many officers privately admitted to him that they recognized their own biases in his actions. These conversations, difficult as they were, began to create a culture of introspection that had been sorely lacking. One particularly meaningful moment came when Sullivan was paired with a rookie officer, James Chen, for a patrol shift. As they drove through Beacon Hill, Chen pointed out a well-dressed white man standing on a corner checking his phone. "Should we stop him?" Chen asked, half joking. He looked suspicious. Sullivan pulled the cruiser over and turned to his young partner. "Let me tell you what I've learned about assumptions," he began, and proceeded to share the full story of his encounter with Judge Thompson. By the end of the shift, Chen had a new understanding of the responsibility that came with wearing the badge. It's not just about catching bad guys, he reflected. It's about knowing the difference between actual suspicious behavior and our own prejudices. Exactly, Sullivan agreed. And that's a lesson I learned the hard way. Meanwhile, Marcus had begun conducting weekly seminars at the police academy, using his own experience as a starting point for broader discussions about constitutional rights, probable cause, and the role of law enforcement in a diverse society. The sessions were initially met with skepticism by some officers, but Marcus's approach, educational rather than accusatory, gradually won them over. During one such session, a veteran officer raised his hand. "Judge Thompson, I've been on the force for 22 years. I've always thought of myself as fair, as someone who treats everyone equally. But listening to you, I'm realizing how many unconscious decisions I make every day based on appearance. How do we change something that's so ingrained?" Marcus leaned against the podium, considering the question. "The first step is exactly what you just did, recognizing that the bias exists. The second step is actively working to counter it. Before you make a stop, ask yourself, would I be doing this if the person looked different? If the answer is no, then you need to reconsider your actions." The officer nodded thoughtfully. "It's not easy to admit we've been doing something wrong for so long." "No, it's not," Marcus agreed, "but it's necessary. And the fact that you're here asking these questions shows that change is possible." As the weeks turned into months, the impact of that morning's arrest continued to ripple outward. The Boston Police Department's new bias training program, developed in collaboration with Judge Thompson, began to attract attention from departments across the country. What had started as a wrongful arrest was becoming a model for police reform. The media attention eventually died down, as it always does, but the changes remained. Officers who had once rolled their eyes at diversity training now engaged seriously with the material. Stop and frisk statistics began to show a more equitable distribution across racial lines. Community trust in law enforcement, while still fragile, showed signs of improvement. One evening, 3 months after the incident, Marcus received an unexpected visitor in his chambers. Officer Sullivan stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Your Honor," Sullivan began, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot, "I hope I'm not interrupting. Your secretary said you might have a few minutes." Marcus looked up from the brief he'd been reviewing, genuinely surprised to see the officer standing there. "Officer Sullivan, please come in, have a seat." Sullivan entered the chambers hesitantly, taking in the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the dignified portraits of former chief judges, and the view of Boston Harbor through the tall windows. It was a far cry from the sterile booking room where they'd last had a meaningful conversation. "I wanted to..." Sullivan paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few months. About that morning, about everything that's happened since. I realized I never properly thanked you." "Thanked me?" Marcus set aside his reading glasses. For what exactly? For not destroying my career, for turning what could have been the end of everything into a chance to become a better cop. Sullivan's voice grew steadier as he spoke. You could have had my badge. Most people in your position would have demanded it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. The arrogance he'd seen that morning in November had been replaced by something else, humility perhaps, or hard-won wisdom. Officer Sullivan, I wasn't interested in ending your career. I was interested in changing it. The question is, has it changed? Sullivan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook worn from constant use. I've been keeping track, like you suggested in one of your seminars. Every stop I make, I write down not just what happened, but what I was thinking, what assumptions I was making. He flipped through pages filled with neat handwriting. Last week I stopped a teenager in Cambridge. Black kid, wearing expensive sneakers, carrying a backpack. 3 months ago, I would have assumed those shoes were stolen, would have asked him to prove where he got them. And last week I asked myself why I thought that. Realized I was falling into the same pattern, so instead I just asked if he was having a good day, reminded him to be careful crossing Mass Ave, because traffic's been crazy with the construction. Turns out he's a sophomore at MIT, brilliant kid. We talked about his robotics project for 10 minutes. Marcus smiled. That's progress, Officer Sullivan. Real progress. Derek, Sullivan corrected. Please call me Derek, and there's something else. He hesitated, then continued. I've been selected to lead the department's new community relations initiative. Captain Rodriguez put my name forward. She says I have a unique perspective now. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The officer who had arrested the chief judge for being black in the wrong neighborhood was now being tasked with improving police community relations. How do you feel about that? Marcus asked. Terrified, Derek admitted. But also, ready, if that makes sense. I figure if I can learn from my mistakes, maybe I can help others avoid making them in the first place. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Gladys Freeman poked her head in. Your Honor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but D.A. Chen is here. She says it's urgent. Marcus glanced at Derek. Would you mind waiting outside for a moment? I'd like to continue our conversation. As Derek stepped out, Michelle Chen swept into the office, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Marcus, we have a situation. There's been an officer-involved shooting in Roxbury. Teenager, unarmed. The officer is claiming self-defense, but witnesses are telling a different story. Marcus felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. When did this happen? 2 hours ago. The community is already gathering at the scene. The mayor's office is in crisis mode and the police union is circling the wagons. She paused. The officer involved, he was one of the ones who walked out of your bias training sessions last month. Said it was politically correct nonsense. Through the partially open door, Marcus could see Derek stiffen at the news. He made a decision. Officer Sullivan, please come back in. I think you should hear this. Derek re-entered, his expression grave as Michelle filled them in on the details. 17-year-old Malik Harris had been walking home from basketball practice when Officer Thomas Brennan stopped him for matching the description of a robbery suspect. What happened next was disputed, but the result was tragically clear. Malik was in critical condition at Boston Medical Center with a gunshot wound to the chest. The preliminary investigation suggests Malik was reaching for his phone to call his mother, Michelle explained. Officer Brennan says he thought it was a weapon. Derek's jaw clenched. Brennan's old school, 28 years on the force. He's been vocal about opposing the new training requirements. You know him? Marcus asked. We've worked together. He trained me when I was a rookie. Derek's voice was heavy with conflicted loyalty. He's not a bad cop, but he's set in his ways. Thinks all this talk about bias is just liberal hand-wringing. Michelle's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her face tightened. The hospital. Malik didn't make it. The room fell silent. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, thinking of all the Maliks he'd seen in his courtroom over the years, all the young lives derailed or ended by split-second decisions born of fear and prejudice. "The community is going to explode," Michelle said quietly, "and honestly, I can't blame them. We've been talking about change for months, and then this happens." Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city he'd sworn to serve. "Derek, I have a proposition for you. It's going to be difficult, and it might make you very unpopular with some of your colleagues." "What kind of proposition?" "I want you to be part of the investigation team. Not as Brennan's defender, not as the department's shield, but as someone who can bridge the gap between what the community needs to hear and what the police are willing to say." Derek looked stunned. "Your Honor, I'm not a detective. I'm just a patrol officer." "You're a patrol officer who has publicly acknowledged his own biases and worked to overcome them. Right now, that makes you uniquely qualified." Marcus turned to Michelle. "What do you think?" The DA considered for a moment. "It's unconventional, but these are unconventional times. The community might actually listen to an officer who admits the system isn't perfect." Over the next several hours, as news of Malik's death spread through Boston's neighborhoods, the three of them worked to develop a response that might prevent the city from erupting. By evening, when the first protesters began gathering outside police headquarters, they had the outline of a plan. The following morning, Derek found himself standing in a community center in Roxbury, facing a room full of angry, grieving residents. The police chief had wanted to send the usual departmental spokesperson, but Marcus and Michelle had insisted on a different approach. "My name is Officer Derek Sullivan," he began, his voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere. 3 months ago, I arrested Judge Marcus Thompson because I made assumptions based on the color of his skin. I was wrong. I've spent every day since then trying to understand how I could have been so wrong, and how to make sure I never make that mistake again. The room remained tense, but people were listening. "I'm not here to defend Officer Brennan's actions. I'm here to listen to your concerns and to promise you that this investigation will be different. We're going to involve community members at every step. We're going to be transparent about our findings, and we're going to use this tragedy to push for the changes we all know are necessary." An elderly man in the front row stood up. "We've heard promises before, officer. Why should we believe you?" Derek met his gaze directly. "Because I'm not just making promises. I'm making myself accountable. Here's my direct phone number." He wrote it on the whiteboard behind him. "If you feel like this investigation isn't being handled properly, call me. Day or night, I'll answer." The gesture was small but significant. No officer had ever given the community such direct access before. It was a crack in the blue wall, and everyone in the room recognized it. Over the following weeks, Derek became the unlikely face of the department's reform efforts. He attended every community meeting, answered every phone call, and pushed internally for transparency, even when it made him unpopular with his fellow officers. Some called him a traitor. Others, particularly younger officers, began to see him as a model for what modern policing could look like. The investigation into Malik's shooting was painstaking and public in a way that no police investigation had been before. Community representatives sat in on witness interviews. The forensic evidence was reviewed by independent experts, and when the findings showed that Officer Brennan had indeed acted on prejudice rather than genuine threat, it was Derek who stood before the cameras to announce it. "The evidence shows that Officer Brennan's actions were influenced by racial bias," he stated clearly. "Malik Harris died because an officer saw a threat where none existed. This is not acceptable. This is not what we train for. This is not who we should be." The admission sent shockwaves through the department. The police union condemned Derek publicly, calling him a political pawn. But something remarkable was happening at the street level. Officers who had privately harbored doubts about the old ways of doing things began to speak up. The tide was turning. Marcus watched these developments with mixed emotions. Progress was being made, but at such a terrible cost. He found himself thinking often of Malik Harris, of the future that young man would never have. In his chambers, he kept a photo from the newspaper. Malik in his basketball uniform, smiling broadly, full of potential that would never be realized. One evening, as he prepared to leave for the day, his phone rang. It was Derek. "Your Honor, I just wanted you to know, Officer Brennan turned in his badge today. Said he couldn't serve in a department that had lost its way." There was a pause. "I think he meant a department that was finding its way, but couldn't see it." "How are you holding up, Derek?" "It's hard. Half the department treats me like a hero, the other half like a pariah. But you know what? Every time I doubt myself, I think about Malik, about how different things might have been if Brennan had taken 30 seconds to see him as a kid with a phone instead of a threat with a weapon. Change is never easy," Marcus reflected, "especially when it challenges everything people believe about themselves." "Judge Thompson, Marcus, do you think we're making a real difference, or are we just putting Band-Aids on bullet wounds?" Marcus considered the question carefully. 3 months ago, you would have been Officer Brennan in that situation. Today, you're the one leading the investigation into his actions. If that's not real change, I don't know what is. After ending the call, Marcus sat alone in his chambers as dusk settled over the city. The work was far from over. There would be more Maliks, more Brennans, more moments when split-second decisions carried life-or-death consequences. But there would also be more Dereks, officers willing to confront their own biases, to admit their mistakes, to do the hard work of change. The system was bending, slowly but surely, toward justice. And sometimes, Marcus reflected, that journey begins with something as simple as a traffic stop on a November morning, when assumptions collide with reality and everyone involved is forced to see the world through different eyes. As he finally headed home, Marcus passed the courthouse security desk where Officer Janet Williams, one of Derek's trainees, was just coming on duty. She straightened as he approached. "Evening, Your Honor? Working late again?" "The work never really ends, Officer Williams. How are the new protocols going?" Her face brightened. "Actually, sir, I wanted to tell you, yesterday I was about to stop someone because they looked out of place in the financial district. Then I heard Officer Sullivan's voice in my head asking what made them look out of place besides how they were dressed. Turns out it was a new intern at State Street just lost on his first day. I ended up giving him directions instead of grief." Marcus smiled. "That's exactly how it's supposed to work." As he stepped out into the cool Boston evening, Marcus thought about the ripple effects of that morning's arrest. One moment of injustice had sparked a movement toward justice. One officer's mistake had become a catalyst for systemic change. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was progress. And in the delicate balance between law and justice, progress was everything. 6 months after Malik Harris's death, the Massachusetts Superior Court was hearing arguments in Commonwealth v. Reynolds, a case that would test the very reforms Marcus and Derek had been fighting to implement. The defendant, Jamal Reynolds, had been arrested under circumstances eerily similar to Marcus's own experience, but with one crucial difference. The arresting officer had been wearing a body camera, and the footage told a very different story from the official police report. Marcus presided over the packed courtroom with his characteristic calm authority, acutely aware that every eye in the gallery was watching, not just for the legal precedent this case might set, but for how the chief judge, who had himself been wrongfully arrested, would handle such a matter. "The defense may call its next witness," Marcus announced. Defense attorney Sarah Goldstein rose. Your Honor, the defense calls Officer Derek Sullivan. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Derek made his way to the witness stand. He was testifying as an expert witness on police bias and training protocols, a role that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. As he was sworn in, Marcus caught the eye of Officer Patricia Martinez sitting in the gallery. She gave a slight nod of encouragement to her former partner. Officer Sullivan, Goldstein began, you've reviewed the body camera footage from Mr. Reynolds' arrest. Can you walk us through what you observed? Derek cleared his throat. The footage shows Officer Mitchell conducting what he described in his report as a routine stop based on suspicious behavior. However, the video reveals that Mr. Reynolds was simply walking down the street talking on his phone. And what happened next? Officer Mitchell approached Mr. Reynolds and immediately demanded identification. When Mr. Reynolds asked why he was being stopped, Officer Mitchell became agitated and ordered him to put his hands on the wall. The situation escalated from there. The prosecutor, a young ADA named Richard Hoffman, objected. Your Honor, Officer Sullivan isn't a video analysis expert. Marcus considered for a moment. Officer Sullivan has been certified as an expert in bias recognition and police procedures. He may continue, but please focus on the procedural aspects, officer. Derek nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. The issue isn't just what's on the video, but what's missing from the officer's report. Officer Mitchell wrote that Mr. Reynolds was acting suspiciously and appeared to be casing buildings. The video shows no such behavior. It shows a man having a phone conversation while walking. In your expert opinion, Goldstein continued, what factors may have influenced Officer Mitchell's decision to stop Mr. Reynolds? Based on my training and experience, including my own past mistakes, I believe Officer Mitchell saw a young black man in a predominantly white neighborhood and made assumptions about criminal intent without any behavioral indicators to support those assumptions. The testimony continued for another hour, with Derek methodically breaking down the disparities between the police report and the video evidence. When Hoffman cross-examined him, trying to paint him as biased against fellow officers, Derek remained composed. Officer Sullivan, isn't it true that you've become something of a departmental pariah for testifying against fellow officers? Derek straightened in his seat. Some officers have expressed disagreement with my positions, yes. But I took an oath to serve and protect, not to protect officers who violate that oath. If that makes me unpopular, so be it. After Derek stepped down, the trial continued with testimony from Dr. Angela Foster, a psychology professor specializing in implicit bias. Marcus had actually attended one of her lectures as part of his own education following his arrest. Dr. Foster, Goldstein asked, can you explain the concept of confirmation bias as it relates to law enforcement? Certainly. Confirmation bias occurs when we interpret information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. In law enforcement, this might manifest as an officer who believes certain demographic groups are more likely to commit crimes and therefore interprets innocent behaviors as suspicious when exhibited by members of those groups. As the trial progressed over several days, it became clear that this case was about more than just Jamal Reynolds. It was a referendum on the old ways versus the new, on whether the reforms implemented after Marcus's arrest and Malik's death were genuine or merely cosmetic. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was charged but notably different from previous police misconduct trials. Community groups that once protested were now working alongside reform-minded officers to ensure peaceful demonstrations. Derek often stood between the two groups, literally and figuratively, bridging the gap. On the trial's final day, as closing arguments approached, Marcus received word that Officer Mitchell wanted to address the court. This was highly unusual, but after consulting with both attorneys, Marcus allowed it. Mitchell, a 15-year veteran with graying temples and tired eyes, stood before the court. "Your Honor, I've been listening to the testimony these past days, and I've done a lot of thinking. I want to withdraw my not guilty plea to the false report charge." The courtroom erupted. Marcus gavelled for order. "Officer Mitchell, you understand the implications of changing your plea at this stage?" "I do, Your Honor. I've realized I've been doing this job the same way for 15 years. Never questioned my instincts, never wondered if maybe those instincts were based on something other than good police work." Hearing Officer Sullivan testify, seeing that video played over and over, I can't deny it anymore. I stopped Mr. Reynolds because he was black in a white neighborhood. Nothing more. The admission sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. That evening, Derek found himself fielding calls from officers across the state, some angry, others quietly admitting they saw themselves in Mitchell's confession. 2 days later, Judge Marcus Thompson delivered his ruling in the Reynolds case. The courtroom was standing room only, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in the hallway. "This case," Marcus began, "represents a pivotal moment in our ongoing struggle to balance public safety with civil rights. The evidence presented here reveals not just individual failure, but systemic issues that we must address." He went on to dismiss all charges against Jamal Reynolds and ordered a comprehensive review of Officer Mitchell's past arrests. But it was his closing remarks that would be quoted in law journals and civil rights publications for years to come. "The badge confers authority, but it also demands responsibility. When we allow assumptions to override evidence, when we permit bias to masquerade as instinct, we betray not just the individuals we've sworn to protect, but the very principles of justice we claim to uphold. This court finds that the arrest of Jamal Reynolds was unconstitutional, based on racial profiling rather than reasonable suspicion. More importantly, this court calls upon every law enforcement agency in the Commonwealth to examine not just their policies, but their culture. Change begins with acknowledgement, continues with education, and succeeds only through sustained commitment." After court adjourned, Marcus returned to his chambers to find Derek waiting. "Quite a day," Marcus observed, removing his robes. "Your Honor, Marcus, I wanted to thank you. What you said in there about change beginning with acknowledgement, that's what you gave me that morning. The chance to acknowledge my mistakes and change. You did the hard work, Derek. I just pointed you in the right direction." Derek smiled wryly. "By arresting you. Sometimes we find wisdom in the most unlikely places." Their conversation was interrupted by Gladys. "Judge Thompson, there's a delegation here to see you. Community leaders, police officials, and, you'll want to see this, Officer Mitchell." Marcus and Derek exchanged glances. "Send them in," Marcus said. The group that entered was diverse in every sense, black and white, civilian and law enforcement, young and old. Officer Mitchell stepped forward first. "Judge Thompson, Officer Sullivan, I'm resigning from the force, but before I go, I want to help. I want to be part of the solution." Reverend James Wallace, a prominent community leader, spoke next. "Judge, we've been talking, all of us. We want to propose something, a Citizen Police Reconciliation Commission, not just oversight, but actual partnership. And we want Officer Sullivan to help lead it." Derek looked stunned. "Me?" "You've become a bridge," said Maria Rodriguez, a youth advocate who had been one of the police department's harshest critics. "You admit mistakes, you listen, you change. We need more of that." Over the following months, the Boston model, as it came to be known, began to take shape. The Reconciliation Commission brought together community members and police officers for regular dialogues. Officer Mitchell, true to his word, became one of its most dedicated volunteers, working with Derek to develop new training scenarios based on real incidents. The police academy curriculum was overhauled. Every recruit now spent time in the communities they would serve, not as authority figures, but as listeners and learners. The body camera program was expanded, with footage regularly reviewed, not just for misconduct but for examples of positive interactions that could be used in training. Derek, promoted to sergeant, found himself traveling to other cities to share the lessons learned in Boston. At a conference in Chicago, he stood before hundreds of officers and told his story, the whole story, including the morning he arrested his own chief judge. "I used to think admitting mistakes made you weak," he told them. "Now I know it's what makes you strong. Strong enough to change, strong enough to lead, strong enough to truly protect and serve." Meanwhile, Marcus continued to preside over cases that pushed the boundaries of criminal justice reform, but his most important work, he often felt, happened outside the courtroom. The monthly community forums he hosted brought together people who had never spoken to each other before, teenagers from Roxbury sharing their experiences with suburban officers, veteran cops explaining the pressures they faced to rookie community activists. One evening, after a particularly productive forum, Marcus found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a photograph and a handwritten note. The photo showed a group of young people, black and white, laughing with several police officers at a community basketball game. The note read, "Judge Thompson, I'm Malik Harris's cousin. For months after Malik died, I hated every cop I saw. Then I met Sergeant Sullivan at one of your forums. He didn't try to justify what happened to Malik. He just listened. Then he asked if I wanted to help make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. I'm starting the police academy next month. I'm going to be the kind of cop Malik deserved to meet that night. Thank you for showing us change is possible. Antoine Harris." Marcus set the note on his desk, next to the picture of Malik he still kept. Progress, he thought, sometimes grows from the deepest pain. As the first anniversary of his arrest approached, Marcus received an invitation to speak at the National Conference of Chief Judges. The topic, "When Justice Meets the Street, a Personal Journey Through Systemic Reform." Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of his fellow judges, Marcus began, "1 year ago I was arrested for being black in the wrong neighborhood. Today I want to tell you about the officer who arrested me and how he became one of our city's greatest advocates for justice. This is a story about assumptions and transformations, about the courage to admit wrong and the harder courage to make things right." In the audience, Derek Sullivan sat with Captain Rodriguez and Officer Martinez. As Marcus spoke, Derek thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment, a journey that began with handcuffs and assumptions, but continued with understanding and change. After the speech, as people milled about, networking and discussing the presentation, a young law student approached Derek. "Sergeant Sullivan, I'm writing my thesis on police reform. Could I ask you something?" "Of course." "If you could go back to that morning, would you do anything differently?" Derek considered for a moment. "If I could go back, I wouldn't have stopped Judge Thompson. But if I hadn't stopped him, I wouldn't be here now, and neither would the changes we've made. Sometimes our worst mistakes become our greatest teachers." The student nodded, scribbling notes. "And what's the most important lesson?" Derek glanced across the room at Marcus, who was now surrounded by other judges eager to learn about the Boston model. That change isn't just possible, it's necessary, and it starts the moment we're willing to say, "I was wrong." 2 years had passed since that fateful morning on Beacon Street, and the Boston model had become a case study in police reform. Yet not all change came easily, and not everyone welcomed it. The resistance, when it finally organized itself, came from an unexpected source. Detective Frank Castellano had been with the Boston Police Department for 26 years. A decorated officer with more commendations than anyone could count, he represented the old guard, tough, uncompromising, and deeply skeptical of what he called social work policing. As he sat in the crowded back room of O'Malley's pub with a dozen other veteran officers, his frustration was palpable. "This isn't police work anymore," he declared, slamming his beer on the scarred wooden table. "We're so busy worrying about feelings and forms that real criminals are laughing at us. Crime stats are up in 3 districts, but nobody wants to talk about that." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Officer Bill Murphy, nursing his 3rd whiskey, leaned forward. "My kid's thinking about joining the force. I told him to go into accounting instead. At least there he won't get crucified for doing his job." "Sullivan's got everyone walking on eggshells," another officer chimed in. "One wrong word, one misunderstanding, and suddenly you're in sensitivity training for a month." Castellano nodded grimly. "It's time we pushed back. The union's been too quiet. We need to remind people what real police work looks like." Meanwhile, across town in his chambers, Marcus Thompson was reviewing a troubling report. Despite the progress made with the Boston model, certain crime statistics were indeed rising. Car thefts were up 12%, residential burglaries had increased by 8%, and there had been a marked uptick in drug-related incidents in several neighborhoods. His phone buzzed. It was Derek Sullivan. "Marcus, we've got a situation. There's been an officer-involved shooting in Dorchester. The officer, it's Bill O'Brien, one of Castellano's guys. Claims the suspect pulled a weapon, but witnesses are saying otherwise." Marcus felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. Body camera? Conveniently malfunctioning. Castellano's already talking to the press, saying this proves we've handicapped officers with all our reforms. An hour later, Marcus stood at his window, watching as protesters gathered outside the courthouse. The fragile peace they'd built over 2 years was threatening to unravel. His phone rang again. This time it was Mayor Patricia Williams. "Judge Thompson, I need you at City Hall. The police union just called a press conference and Castellano's leading it. They're demanding a return to traditional policing methods. The community groups are mobilizing in response. We're sitting on a powder keg." The press conference was already underway when Marcus arrived at City Hall. Castellano stood at a podium flanked by union representatives, his silver hair and stern demeanor giving him an air of unquestionable authority. "For 2 years, we've watched our city become a social experiment," he was saying. "Officers are afraid to do their jobs. Criminals know they can cry bias and walk free. The Thompson-Sullivan reforms have made our streets less safe, not more." A reporter raised her hand. "Detective Castellano, what about the significant decrease in complaints against officers? The improved community trust scores?" Castellano's jaw tightened. "Trust doesn't stop bullets. Feel-good forums don't prevent break-ins. We need to let cops be cops again." As the press conference continued, Derek arrived at City Hall, looking haggard. He found Marcus in the mayor's conference room, where they were joined by Captain Rodriguez, DA Michelle Chen, and several community leaders. "He's not wrong about the crime stats," Derek admitted reluctantly. "Some categories are up, but correlation isn't causation. We can't prove the reforms are responsible." "Doesn't matter," Michelle said grimly. "Perception is reality in politics. If people believe the reforms made them less safe, then we lose everything we've built," Marcus finished. The following days saw Boston divided like never before. Pro-police rallies faced off against reform advocates. Social media exploded with competing hashtags. Your "Let Cops Be Cops" versus your "Keep the Progress." The shooting in Dorchester remained under investigation, but the court of public opinion was already in session. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. As chief judge, he had to remain impartial. Yet as the catalyst for the reforms, he couldn't stay silent. He decided to take an unprecedented step, calling for a public summit on police reform and public safety. The summit was held at Boston University's Psi Performance Center, chosen for its neutral ground and ample capacity. The 200-seat venue was packed, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent buildings. Media from across the country descended on Boston to cover what many were calling a defining moment in American policing. Marcus opened the summit with characteristic directness. "We're here because our city is at a crossroads. 2 years ago, we began a journey toward a new kind of policing. Today, we must honestly assess where that journey has taken us." The format was unusual, not speeches, but structured dialogue. Castellano and Derek would present their perspectives, followed by questions from a panel including community members, crime victims, police officers, and academic experts. Castellano went first, his presentation backed by graphs and statistics. "Since the implementation of the Boston model, we've seen a 12% increase in property crimes, an 8% rise in drug offenses, and a 15% drop in arrest rates. Officers report spending 40% more time on paperwork and community meetings, leaving less time for actual patrol." He clicked to a slide showing response times. Average response to priority calls has increased by 2.3 minutes. That might not sound like much, but when someone's breaking into your house, every second counts. The audience stirred uneasily. These were hard numbers, difficult to dispute. Derek took the podium next. "Detective Castellano's statistics are accurate but incomplete. Yes, some crime categories have increased, but let's look at the whole picture." He brought up his own slides. Violent crime is down 18%. Use of force incidents have dropped 45%. Community trust in police has risen from 31% to 64%. He clicked to the next slide. False arrest lawsuits against the department have decreased by 70%, saving taxpayers over $3 million. Officer injuries are down 22%. And here's something interesting. In neighborhoods where community policing is most active, crime has actually decreased across all categories. The panel began their questioning. A grandmother from Roxbury stood first. "My grandson was killed in a drive-by last month. The police knew the shooters were targeting that corner, but they were too busy at some community meeting to patrol it. How is that progress?" The raw pain in her voice silenced the room. Derek struggled to respond. "Ma'am, I am so sorry for your loss. You're right. We have to find a better balance." A young officer raised his hand next. "I joined the force because of Sergeant Sullivan's example, but now I spend more time filling out bias report forms than catching criminals. How do we protect people while walking on eggshells?" Marcus, moderating the panel, turned to address both concerns. "These questions strike at the heart of our challenge. How do we maintain both safety and justice? How do we protect without profiling?" The summit continued for hours, with passionate arguments from all sides. Business owners complained about increased shoplifting. Civil rights advocates presented data on reduced racial disparities in arrests. Officers spoke about feeling unsupported. Community members shared stories of improved police interactions. As the day wore on, an unexpected voice emerged. Officer Bill O'Brien, the officer involved in the Dorchester shooting, asked to speak. The room tensed as he approached the microphone. "I've been a cop for 12 years, he began, his voice shaking slightly. 3 days ago, I shot someone. The investigation is ongoing, so I can't talk details. But I can tell you this. In that moment, I was scared. Not just of the situation, but of making a mistake, of ending up on the news, of being the next viral video." He paused, collecting himself. "Maybe that fear made me hesitate. Maybe it made me act too quickly. I don't know anymore. But I do know this. We can't police effectively if we're policing scared, and we can't serve a community that doesn't trust us. There has to be a middle ground." The honesty of his admission created a shift in the room. Castellano looked uncomfortable, while Derek nodded thoughtfully. Marcus seized the moment. "Officer O'Brien has touched on something crucial. Fear, on both sides, is the enemy of good policing. The question is, How do we build a system that reduces fear rather than creates it? In the final hour of the summit, something remarkable began to happen. Instead of defending entrenched positions, participants started seeking solutions. Castellano suggested modified training that addressed both bias and tactical concerns. Community leaders proposed neighborhood watch programs that worked with, not against, police. Derek outlined plans for better resource allocation to balance community engagement with active patrol. As the summit concluded, Marcus addressed the crowd one final time. We haven't solved everything today, but we've done something important. We've listened to each other. The Boston model isn't perfect. No system is. But the answer isn't to abandon reform, it's to refine it. The aftermath of the summit saw the emergence of what became known as Boston Model 2.0. It maintained the core principles of bias training and community engagement while addressing legitimate concerns about crime prevention and officer safety. Key innovations included hybrid patrol units that combined community officers with tactical response teams, streamlined reporting systems that reduced paperwork by 30%, data-driven deployment that put more officers in high-crime areas during peak hours, peer support programs pairing reform-minded officers with skeptics, community safety councils that included both reform advocates and law enforcement veterans. Castellano, somewhat surprisingly, agreed to co-chair the implementation committee with Derek. I still think some of this is nonsense, he admitted during their first meeting, but if we're going to do it, let's do it right. 6 months later, the results began to show. Crime rates stabilized, then started declining. Community trust continued to improve. Officer morale, which had plummeted during the controversy, began to recover. Marcus watched these developments with cautious optimism. In his chambers one evening, reviewing the latest reports, he found a handwritten note that Gladys had placed on his desk. Judge Thompson, I'm the grandmother who spoke at the summit about losing my grandson. I wanted you to know. The officers who investigated his murder just made an arrest. They worked with the community, got people to talk who never would have before. Detective Castellano personally kept me updated. I still hurt every day, but at least now I have hope for justice. Thank you for listening. Edna Williams. Below the note was a newspaper clipping. Boston Model 2.0 gaining national attention. Other cities seek to replicate success. As Marcus filed the note away, Derek knocked on his door. Busy? Always. What brings you by? Derek sat down, looking tired but satisfied. Just got off the phone with Chicago PD. They want us to help them implement something similar. And get this, Castellano volunteered to go with me. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Frank Castellano, champion of reform? He says someone needs to make sure we don't go full social worker. Derek chuckled. But I think he's starting to see the value in what we're doing. Change comes in many forms, Marcus mused. Sometimes it's sudden, like that morning 2 years ago. Sometimes it's gradual, like Frank's evolution. Speaking of that morning, Derek said, I've been thinking, if you could go back, would you change anything? Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering. You know, I've asked myself that question many times. Being arrested was humiliating, frustrating, anger-inducing. But look what came from it, real change, lasting change. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the catalyst for the best work we'll ever do. Derek nodded. I arrested a judge and found my purpose. You got arrested and changed a city. Strange how things work out. Justice has a way of finding its own path, Marcus replied, even when that path leads through a booking room on a November morning. As Derek left, Marcus turned back to his window, looking out over the city lights. Boston wasn't perfect, no city was. But it was better than it had been, and getting better still. The work continued, one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one changed mind at a time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conflicts, new opportunities for growth. But tonight, Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, not for what had been accomplished, but for what was possible when people chose courage over comfort, dialogue over division, and progress over perfection. 3 years into the implementation of Boston Model 2.0, the program faced its most severe test yet. On a humid August evening, a series of coordinated attacks rocked the city's financial district. 3 banks were robbed simultaneously, with the perpetrators using sophisticated technology to disable security systems and evade capture. The robberies were violent, leaving 2 security guards critically injured and the city on edge. The pressure on the police department was immediate and intense. News outlets ran continuous coverage, social media erupted with demands for action, and the mayor's office fielded endless calls from frightened citizens. This was exactly the kind of high-profile crime that critics of reform had warned about. Detective Frank Castellano found himself leading the investigation, with Derek Sullivan as his second-in-command. The pairing, once unthinkable, had become one of the department's most effective partnerships. But this case would strain even their hard-won mutual respect. "We need to lock down the entire financial district," Castellano argued during the morning briefing. "Random stops, bag checks, show of force. Let these criminals know we mean business." Derek shook his head. "Frank, that's exactly what we've been trying to move away from. Blanket suspicion, treating everyone like a potential criminal. It'll destroy the trust we've built." "Trust?" Castellano's voice rose. 2 guards are fighting for their lives and you're worried about trust? This is what I was talking about 2 years ago. When push comes to shove, all this reform talk goes out the window. Marcus, who had been invited to observe the investigation as part of the oversight committee, watched the exchange carefully. The tension in the room was palpable, with officers clearly divided between the 2 approaches. Captain Rodriguez intervened. "What we need is smart policing, not just tough policing. Derek, what's your alternative?" Derek pulled up a map on the screen. "Community intelligence. We've spent 3 years building relationships in these neighborhoods. Let's use them. Put the word out through our community liaisons, offer rewards, work with business owners who know their regular customers. And while we're having coffee clatches, these guys hit another bank." Castellano shot back. The debate continued for another hour, ultimately resulting in a compromise: increased patrols in the financial district, but with officers trained in community policing methods leading the effort. It was an uneasy balance that satisfied no one completely. As the investigation progressed, the pressure mounted. A 4th bank was hit, this time in broad daylight. The perpetrators seemed to be taunting the police, leaving behind a note that read, "Your new methods can't catch old-school criminals." That evening, as Derek was leaving the precinct, he found Officer Bill O'Brien waiting by his car. O'Brien had become one of the reform movement's most vocal supporters after the Dorchester shooting incident, but tonight he looked troubled. "Sarge, we need to talk. Some of the guys, they're planning something. Off-the-book surveillance, maybe worse. They think the reforms are handcuffing us with these robberies." Derek felt his stomach tighten. "Who's involved?" "I can't say for sure, but Castellano's old crew is meeting at Murphy's place tonight. They're talking about taking matters into their own hands." Derek immediately called Marcus. Within an hour, they were in an emergency meeting with Captain Rodriguez and Internal Affairs. The situation was delicate. They couldn't act on hearsay, but they couldn't ignore the possibility of rogue officers either. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Rodriguez said grimly. "The pressure of high-profile crimes pushing officers to abandon protocol." Marcus leaned forward. "The question is, how do we handle this without destroying the progress we've made? If we come down too hard, we risk alienating officers who are on the fence about reforms. Too soft, and we enable dangerous behavior." As they debated their response, Derek's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check the warehouse district tonight, 2 a.m. The message sent chills down his spine. Was this a tip about the robbers, or about the rogue officers? Or was it a trap? After much deliberation, they decided to set up surveillance on both the warehouse district and the suspected rogue officers. It was a risky move that stretched their resources thin, but it seemed the only way to address both threats. At 1:45 a.m., Derek and a carefully selected team positioned themselves around the warehouse district. The area was dark, with only scattered streetlights providing illumination. Meanwhile, internal affairs officers discreetly monitored the homes of the suspected rogue cops. At precisely 2 a.m., movement in Warehouse 17 caught their attention. Through night vision binoculars, Derek saw 4 figures moving equipment into a van. His heart raced. Could these be the bank robbers? But before they could move in, Derek's radio crackled with urgent news from internal affairs. We've got activity. 6 officers, including Castellano, are mobilizing. They're headed your way. Derek faced an impossible choice. Move in now and risk a confrontation between official and rogue officers, or wait and potentially lose the suspects. He made a split-second decision. All units, hold position. Let's see how this plays out. Minutes later, Castellano's group arrived, clearly intending to conduct their own raid. Derek watched as they began to surround the warehouse, unaware they were themselves under surveillance. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the warehouse. The suspects had spotted Castellano's team and opened fire. In the chaos that followed, Derek had no choice but to order his official team to engage. All units, move in. Officer safety is priority 1. The next few minutes were a blur of sirens, shouting, and controlled chaos. When the dust settled, 3 suspects were in custody. 1 had escaped, and miraculously, no officers were injured. But the confrontation between the official and rogue teams was unavoidable. "What the hell are you doing here, Sullivan?" Castellano demanded, his face flushed with adrenaline and anger. "My job," Derek replied evenly. "The question is, what are you doing conducting an unauthorized operation?" The standoff was tense, with officers on both sides unsure where their loyalties should lie. It was Marcus, arriving with Captain Rodriguez, who diffused the situation. "Gentlemen, we have 3 bank robbery suspects in custody because you both did your jobs, albeit in very different ways. Right now, let's focus on that success. We'll sort out the rest at the station." The aftermath of the warehouse incident sent shockwaves through the department. The rogue officers faced disciplinary hearings, with Castellano at the center of the controversy. The hearings, held over several days, became a microcosm of the larger debate about policing methods. Castellano's defense was impassioned. "We got results. 3 dangerous criminals off the street. Yes, I bent the rules, but sometimes that's what it takes." Derek testified as well, carefully balancing his role as a reformer with his understanding of the pressures officers faced. Detective Castellano's intentions were good, but his methods were dangerous. "We can't have officers deciding which rules to follow based on their personal judgment. That's not reform, that's anarchy." The disciplinary board, which included Marcus, community representatives, and senior police officials, struggled with their decision. Ultimately, they issued a nuanced ruling. Castellano and his team received suspensions and mandatory retraining but weren't fired. The board acknowledged that while their methods were wrong, their motivations stemmed from a genuine desire to protect the city. The 4th bank robber was eventually caught, thanks to tips from community members who had come to trust the reformed police force. The arrest validated Derek's approach and helped heal some of the divisions within the department. In the months that followed, the warehouse incident became a case study in police academies across the country. It demonstrated both the challenges and the importance of reform, showing that even in high-pressure situations, proper procedures and community trust could yield results. Castellano surprisingly emerged from his suspension with a changed perspective. During his retraining, he worked closely with community groups and began to see the value in the methods he had once dismissed. "I still think we need to be tough on crime," he told Derek during a joint patrol 6 months later. "But I'm starting to see that tough doesn't have to mean disconnected from the community." The evolution of their relationship became symbolic of the broader changes in the department. Where once there had been two rigid camps, reformers and traditionalists, there was now a growing middle ground of officers who understood that effective policing required both strength and sensitivity. Marcus used the incident to push for new legislation that would formalize many of the Boston Model's principles at the state level. The bill, co-sponsored by lawmakers from both parties, included provisions for mandatory bias training, community oversight boards, and funding for programs that paired social workers with police officers on certain calls. During the legislative hearings, Marcus testified about his own journey from wrongful arrest victim to reform advocate. 3 years ago, I was handcuffed on a street corner for the crime of being black in the wrong neighborhood. Today, I sit before you as proof that from our worst moments can come our greatest opportunities for change. The bill passed with broad support, making Massachusetts the first state to comprehensively adopt the Boston Model principles. Other states began drafting similar legislation, with Derek and even Castellano traveling as consultants to share their experiences. One evening, as Marcus prepared to leave his chambers after a particularly long day, he found Derek and Castellano waiting in his outer office. They had just returned from a consulting trip to Detroit, where they had helped that city's police department begin implementing reform measures. "We wanted to thank you," Castellano said somewhat awkwardly, "for not giving up on officers like me, for showing us a better way." Derek nodded. "And for turning that morning 3 years ago into something meaningful. We've trained over 5,000 officers nationwide now. That's 5,000 potential situations that might go differently because of what we learned here." Marcus smiled, thinking back to that cold November morning. "Gentlemen, you did the hard work. You changed, you grew, you showed others it was possible. I just provided the catalyst." As they talked, Gladys brought in the evening paper. The headline read, "Boston Police Model credited with 30% drop in civil rights complaints nationwide." "Look at that," Derek mused. "Who would have thought that arresting a judge would lead to all this?" "Sometimes," Marcus replied, "justice works in mysterious ways. The important thing is that we were willing to learn from our mistakes and do better." Castellano picked up the paper, studying the statistics. "You know what's interesting? Crime rates in cities that adopted our model, they're down too. Not just complaints, but actual crime. Turns out when people trust the police, they're more willing to help solve crimes." It was a revelation that would have been unthinkable to the Frank Castellano of 3 years ago. But like the city of Boston itself, he had evolved, grown, and found a way to balance the demands of public safety with the principles of justice and equality. As the three men left the courthouse together, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The city below bustled with life, people of all backgrounds going about their business, secure in the knowledge that the police force sworn to protect them was working to earn and keep their trust. The journey from that morning's wrongful arrest to this moment of nationwide reform hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, conflicts, and moments when the entire effort seemed ready to collapse. But through persistence, open dialogue, and a willingness to admit mistakes and learn from them, they had created something lasting and meaningful. In police academies, courtrooms, and community centers across America, the story of Officer Sullivan and Judge Thompson was being told and retold, not as a tale of shame or blame, but as an example of how confronting our biases and working together could create real change. The Boston model had become more than just a set of policies. It had become a philosophy, an approach to law enforcement that recognized the humanity in everyone, whether they wore a badge, a robe, or neither. It was proof that with courage, humility, and determination, even the most entrenched systems could be transformed. 5 years after the Boston model's inception, a new generation of police officers was entering the force. Recruits who had never known the old ways, who had studied Marcus Thompson's case in the academy, and who viewed community policing not as reform, but as standard practice. Among them was Officer Maria Santos, 24 years old, top of her class, and assigned to patrol the very neighborhood where Marcus had been arrested. It was a crisp October morning when Santos responded to a call about a suspicious person in Beacon Hill. The irony of the location wasn't lost on her. Every recruit knew this was where the Boston model had begun. As she approached the address, she saw a young black man in a hoodie examining the door of a brownstone. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, keeping her voice neutral and her hands visible. "I'm Officer Santos. We received a call about someone checking doors in the area. Can you help me understand what's going on?" The young man turned, startled. He was perhaps 19, with intelligent eyes that immediately went wary at the sight of her uniform. "I'm just trying to find the right address. I have a job interview." Santos noticed his hands were shaking slightly, not unusual when confronted by police. She remembered her training: assume positive intent, de-escalate, verify facts. "No problem at all. What address are you looking for?" 447 Beacon Street. It's for a tutoring position with the Williamson family." Santos pulled out her phone, not her weapon. "Let me help you out. According to my GPS, 447 is 2 doors down. The numbers are pretty faded on these old buildings." The young man's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you. I was starting to panic about being late." "What's your name?" Santos asked conversationally. David Mitchell." "Well, David, good luck with your interview. The Williamsons are nice people. Their kids are lucky to have you as a tutor." As David headed to the correct address, Santos's partner, veteran officer Tommy Chen, pulled up in their cruiser. "Everything okay?" "Just helping someone find an address," Santos replied, getting into the car. "Remember when this kind of call used to end differently?" Chen nodded. "Before your time, rookie, but yeah, I remember." Their radio crackled. "All units, we have a 1031 at Boston Common. Multiple suspects, possible weapons involved." As they raced toward the Common, Santos felt her training kicking in. A 1031 was a crime in progress. This was real, not a drill. They arrived to find chaos, a group of teenagers scattered across the park, some running, others squared off against each other. Witnesses pointed frantically in different directions. "Knife," someone screamed. "He's got a knife." Santos and Chen split up, each pursuing different groups. Santos found herself chasing 3 teenagers who had broken away from the main group. As she rounded a corner, she came face to face with one of them, a young black male, breathing hard, hand in his pocket. Every instinct screamed danger. Her hand moved toward her weapon, but her training kicked in. Observe, assess, communicate. "Show me your hands," she commanded, but then added, "I want to help. Tell me what's happening." The teenager slowly withdrew his hand, empty. "It's not what you think. We were trying to stop them. They were harassing some kids from our school." More officers arrived, including Sergeant Derek Sullivan. The scene was quickly contained, revealing a complex situation: 2 rival groups of students, a confrontation that had escalated, but no actual weapons beyond some broken bottles from a nearby trash can. As statements were taken, a clearer picture emerged. The group Santos had pursued weren't the aggressors, but had been trying to protect younger students from bullying. The knife was a metal ruler one student used for art class. Later, at the precinct, Derek debriefed with Santos. You did good out there. Could have gone very differently. I almost drew my weapon, Santos admitted, when I saw his hand in his pocket. But you didn't. You assessed. You communicated. That's the difference between old policing and what we do now. The incident might have ended there, just another successful application of the Boston model, except for what happened next. One of the witnesses, an elderly woman named Mrs. Goldstein, posted a video online. It showed Santos's interaction with the teenager, her measured response, her decision to talk rather than shoot. The video went viral, but not in the way police videos usually did. Instead of outrage, it sparked admiration. This Is Policing began trending, with people sharing positive police encounters. The contrast with old footage of arrests in the same location, including grainy security footage of Marcus Thompson's arrest, was stark. Marcus saw the video in his chambers and immediately recognized the location. He called Derek. "I need to meet this officer." The next day, Santos found herself in the chief judge's chambers, feeling somewhat overwhelmed. She knew the history, had studied Marcus's case, but meeting him in person was different. "Officer Santos," Marcus began, "I watched that video several times. Do you know why it moved me so deeply?" "No, Your Honor." "Because 5 years ago in that exact spot I was on the other end of a very different police encounter. Your restraint, your approach, that's what we hoped for when we started this journey." Santos shifted uncomfortably. "I was just following training, sir." "That's exactly the point," Derek interjected. "What's training now was unthinkable then. You represent what we've been working toward." But the story was far from over. The viral video caught the attention of a CNN producer who decided to do a feature on the evolution of American policing using Boston as the centerpiece. The documentary would trace the journey from Marcus's arrest to the current state of the Boston model. As filming began, it unearthed something unexpected. David Mitchell, the young man Santos had helped find his tutoring interview, came forward with his own story. He was the nephew of Malik Harris, the teenager whose death had catalyzed major reforms. His family had moved to Boston specifically because they'd heard about the changes in policing. "When Officer Santos approached me that morning," David told the cameras, "I was terrified. My uncle died because an officer made assumptions. But she didn't assume anything. She asked questions. She helped. That's the difference between life and death sometimes." The documentary brought together all the key players: Marcus, Derek, Frank Castellano, Patricia Martinez, community leaders, and the new generation of officers like Santos. Even Officer Mitchell, now retired and working as a reform advocate, participated. During filming at the police academy, Castellano found himself training rookies alongside Derek, something that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. "The hardest part," Castellano told the recruits, "isn't learning new tactics. It's unlearning old habits. I spent 25 years thinking I knew how to read situations, read people. Turns out I was reading my own biases half the time." A recruit raised her hand. "Detective, do you ever regret the changes? Miss the old ways?" Castellano glanced at Derek before answering. "I miss the simplicity sometimes. It was easier when everything was black and white, no pun intended. But easier isn't better. What we do now, it's harder, but it's right." The documentary's climax featured a powerful scene: Marcus, Derek, and Santos standing at the exact spot where Marcus had been arrested, now marked with a small plaque reading, "On this site, an injustice became a catalyst for justice." 5 years ago," Marcus said to the camera, "I stood here in handcuffs, wrongly accused based on nothing more than the color of my skin. Today I stand here free, watching a new generation of officers who see people, not stereotypes." Santos spoke next. "I never knew the old Boston PD. I only know what we are now. But every day I'm aware that I'm standing on the shoulders of those who fought to change things. My job isn't just to enforce the law, it's to uphold justice. There's a difference. The documentary, titled From Handcuffs to Handshakes, The Boston Model, aired nationally and won several awards. More importantly, it sparked renewed interest in police reform across the country. Cities that had been resistant to change began sending delegations to Boston, but success brought new challenges. As the Boston model gained prominence, it also attracted criticism. Some argued it was too soft on crime, others that it didn't go far enough in addressing systemic racism. A new organization, Police Reform Watch, began scrutinizing every arrest, every interaction, looking for signs that the old ways were creeping back. This scrutiny intensified when a complex case landed on Marcus's docket. Officer Chen, Santos's partner, was accused of using excessive force during an arrest. The body camera footage was ambiguous. The suspect had been resisting, but Chen's response seemed disproportionate. The case became a lightning rod. Reform advocates saw it as proof that change was superficial. Law enforcement supporters argued it showed the impossibility of policing under constant scrutiny. Santos found herself caught in the middle, loyal to her partner, but committed to the principles she'd been taught. During the trial, Santos was called to testify. Her testimony was careful, truthful, neither condemning nor excusing Chen's actions. She described the chaos of the scene, the split-second decisions required, but also acknowledged that alternatives existed. Officer Chen is a good cop, she testified, but even good cops can make mistakes. That's why we have systems, training, accountability, not to punish, but to improve. Marcus, presiding over the case, faced one of his most difficult decisions. The evidence suggested Chen had overreacted but hadn't acted maliciously. The old system might have quietly exonerated him or harshly punished him. The Boston model demanded something more nuanced. In his ruling, Marcus found Chen guilty of excessive force but emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. Chen received a suspension, mandatory retraining, and was required to work with community organizations affected by police violence. This court recognizes that policing is inherently difficult, Marcus wrote in his opinion. Officers face split-second decisions with life-altering consequences. But with great power comes great responsibility. Officer Chen failed to meet the high standards we set, not because he is a bad officer, but because he is human. Our response must be equally human, holding him accountable while providing a path to redemption. The ruling satisfied neither hardliners nor abolitionists, but was widely praised by reform advocates as embodying the balanced approach the Boston model represented. In the aftermath, Chen initially resisted the community service component of his sentence, but working with families affected by police violence changed him. He heard stories that echoed his own fears and frustrations, but from the other side of the badge. "I always thought I understood," Chen told Santos one evening after a particularly emotional session with a support group. "But I didn't. Not really. These families, they're not angry at cops, they're angry at a system that treats mistakes as either unforgivable sins or acceptable casualties. Both extremes are wrong." 6 months later, Chen returned to duty, partnered again with Santos. Their first call, a suspicious person report in Beacon Hill. As they approached, Chen hung back, letting Santos take the lead. The suspicious person turned out to be a renowned architect, surveying buildings for a historical preservation project. He was also black, wearing casual clothes and carrying professional camera equipment that had been mistaken for something sinister. "Evening, sir," Santos greeted him. "We got a call about someone photographing buildings. Everything okay here?" The architect, initially tense, relaxed as Santos explained the call and asked about his work. Chen observed, learning as his younger partner demonstrated the new way forward. Later, as they drove away, Chen reflected, 5 years ago that could have gone very differently. 5 years ago, "You weren't the cop you are now," Santos replied. "None of us were." Back at the precinct, they filed their report. Responded to suspicious person call. Subject identified as professional architect conducting legitimate work. No further action required. Simple words, but they represented something profound. A system that had learned to see people as individuals first, potential threats second. It wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but it was better. And in the delicate balance between safety and justice, better was worth fighting for. As the shift ended, Santos checked her phone to find a message from the architect they'd encountered. "Thank you for treating me like a person, not a problem. This is what good policing looks like." She forwarded it to Derek, who forwarded it to Marcus, who smiled and filed it away with hundreds of similar messages. Each one a small victory, each one proof that change, however difficult, was possible. 7 years after Marcus Thompson's wrongful arrest transformed American policing, Boston faced its greatest test yet. As the city prepared to host the Democratic National Convention, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Protest groups from across the political spectrum planned demonstrations, and the eyes of the world would be on Boston's police force. In the federal courthouse, Marcus reviewed security preparations with city officials, FBI representatives, and police leadership. The stakes couldn't be higher. Any misstep would be broadcast globally, potentially undermining years of progress. "We're expecting over 100,000 protesters," FBI Special Agent Rachel Morse reported. "Everything from climate activists to anti-globalization groups to counter-protesters. Intelligence suggests some groups may attempt to incite violence." Chief Rodriguez, now Boston's first Latina police commissioner, addressed the room. "Our approach remains consistent with the Boston model. De-escalation, community liaison officers embedded with protest groups, and transparent communication. But we're also prepared for worst-case scenarios." Derek Sullivan, recently promoted to Deputy Chief of Community Relations, added, "We've been training for this for months. Every officer knows the protocols. We've even brought in protest leaders for joint planning sessions." As the meeting concluded, Marcus pulled Derek aside. "Are we ready for this?" Derek's expression was grave. "Honestly, I don't know. This is the biggest test we've faced. If we handle it well, it validates everything we've built. If we fail, the whole country will be watching," Marcus finished. As Convention Week approached, the city transformed. Security barriers went up, media trucks lined the streets, and officers from departments nationwide arrived as reinforcements, all trained in Boston model protocols. Among the out-of-town officers was Captain Sarah Williams from Minneapolis, where attempts to implement similar reforms had met fierce resistance. She sought out Derek at the command center. "Deputy Chief Sullivan, I've studied your model extensively, but reading about it and seeing it in action are different things. How do you maintain officer buy-in during high-stress situations?" Derek smiled wryly. "It helps that most of our officers don't know any other way now. And the veterans who remember the old days, they've seen the results. Lower injury rates, better community cooperation, fewer lawsuits. Success breeds success." Officer Maria Santos, now a training sergeant, overheard the conversation. "Ma'am, if I may, the key is muscle memory. When stress hits, officers default to their training. We've made de-escalation our default." The first day of protests began peacefully. Climate activists marched down Commonwealth Avenue, chanting and carrying signs. Community liaison officers walked alongside them, some even helping elderly protesters navigate rough patches of sidewalk. But by afternoon, tensions rose. A group of masked individuals, not affiliated with any registered protest organization, began breaking windows in the financial district. Social media exploded with calls for police action. In the command center, Derek faced a crucial decision. "We have confirmed property damage, but no immediate threat to life. Standard protocol says contain, and de-escalate. Castellano, now Assistant Chief of Operations, disagreed. These aren't peaceful protesters. They're criminals using the protests as cover. We need to move in hard and fast. The debate echoed their confrontation during the bank robberies years earlier, but this time, the stakes were even higher. Every major news network had cameras rolling. Commissioner Rodriguez made the call. Stick to protocol. Contain the violence, protect property, but don't escalate. And keep the peaceful protesters separate. They're not our enemy. As tactical teams moved to isolate the vandals, something remarkable happened. Peaceful protesters, recognizing the threat to their message, began actively pointing out the agitators to police. Years of community relationship building paid dividends as citizens and cops worked together to identify troublemakers. Santos, leading a rapid response team, received a call from a protest organizer she'd worked with during planning. "Maria, we've got 3 guys in black masks heading toward Copley Square. They're not with us. They're carrying bags of what might be Molotov cocktails. Thanks to the tip, officers intercepted the individuals before they could cause harm. The arrest was textbook Boston model, overwhelming but controlled force, immediate de-escalation once subjects were secured, and transparent communication with surrounding crowds about what had occurred. By evening, the situation was under control. Property damage was limited, no serious injuries reported, and the peaceful protests continued uninterrupted. But the real test came that night. Social media lit up with conflicting narratives. Some praised the police response as measured and effective. Others accused them of being too soft on vandals or too aggressive with protesters. Doctored videos began circulating, showing officers in compromising positions that body camera footage would later prove false. Marcus, monitoring the situation from his home, received a call from the mayor. "Judge Thompson, we need your voice on this. The narrative is spiraling. Some people are calling for a return to traditional policing." Within an hour, Marcus was at City Hall for an impromptu press conference joined by Derek, Commissioner Rodriguez, and several protest organizers. Today, Boston's police force faced a complex challenge, Marcus began. They had to distinguish between peaceful protesters exercising constitutional rights and individuals intent on violence. They did so with professionalism and restraint, guided by principles we've spent 7 years embedding in our culture. A protest organizer, Reverend Angela Martinez, spoke next. "I've been organizing demonstrations for 20 years. I've seen police responses that turned peaceful gatherings into war zones. Today, I saw officers protect our right to protest while stopping those who would hijack our message. This is what progress looks like." But the crisis wasn't over. Intelligence suggested a larger, more coordinated action planned for the convention's final day. Extremist groups from both ends of the political spectrum were converging on Boston, each hoping to provoke the other into violence. In the pre-dawn hours, Derek gathered his command staff. The room included faces old and new: Castellano, Santos, Chen, Martinez, and dozens of others who had lived through the department's transformation. "Everything we've built comes down to today," Derek told them. "We're going to have thousands of people with opposing views in close proximity. Our job isn't to stop them from disagreeing, it's to keep them from killing each other while they do it." Castellano, his gruff exterior softened by years of reform, added, "Remember, the whole world's watching. Not just what we do, but how we do it. Stay calm, follow protocol, and trust your training." As protests swelled throughout the day, the Boston model faced its ultimate test. When opposing groups confronted each other near the convention center, officers formed human barriers, not riot lines, but peace lines, facing both groups equally, talking rather than threatening. Santos, working the front lines, found herself between screaming protesters. Instead of ordering them back, she engaged them. "I understand you're angry, You have every right to be here, to express your views, but I need you to do it without hurting each other. Can you help me with that?" Remarkably, many did. Protest leaders from both sides, recognizing the officers' approach, began self-policing their groups. When violence did break out, an inevitable occurrence with such large crowds, response was swift but measured. The defining moment came when a group of anarchists attempted to storm a police barrier. Instead of meeting them with batons and tear gas, officers employed the Boston box, a containment technique that isolated agitators while allowing peaceful protesters to continue. News helicopters captured the scene, officers calmly containing violence while facilitating peaceful protest just yards away. It was policing as choreography, each move practiced and purposeful. By day's end, arrests numbered in the dozens rather than hundreds. Injuries were minimal. Property damage was contained. Most importantly, the convention concluded without major incident, and constitutional rights were preserved. That evening, as exhausted officers filed back to their precincts, Derek received a text from Marcus. "Watching the coverage, you did it. We did it." But the true validation came from an unexpected source. The Minneapolis captain, Sarah Williams, approached Derek as he left the command center. "I came here skeptical," she admitted. "I thought the Boston model was smoke and mirrors, something that only worked because you had unique circumstances. I was wrong. I watched your officers today, young and old, working together, using tactics I thought were impossible. I'm going back to Minneapolis to fight harder for these reforms." In the following days, analysis poured in from around the world. Law enforcement experts, civil rights organizations, and academic researchers all reached similar conclusions. Boston had successfully policed a major political event while respecting civil liberties, providing a model for democratic policing in the 21st century. The New York Times editorial board, often critical of police practices, wrote, "Boston has proven that the choice between safety and civil rights is a false one. With proper training, community engagement, and leadership commitment, police can protect both." A month later, Marcus presided over a ceremony honoring officers who had excelled during the convention. As he pinned commendations on Santos, Chen, and others, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 7 years ago, he told the assembled officers and guests, "I stood on a street corner in handcuffs, victim of assumptions and bias. Today, I stand here celebrating a police force that has proven change is possible. But let me be clear, this isn't the end of our journey. It's proof that the journey is worth taking." Derek stepped to the podium next. "When I arrested Judge Thompson, I thought I was doing my job. I've learned since then that doing your job isn't enough. You have to do it right, with respect for every person's dignity and rights. That's not just good policing, it's the only kind of policing a democracy deserves." The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new training center, funded by a federal grant and private donations. Named the Thompson-Sullivan Institute for Democratic Policing, it would train officers from across the country in Boston model principles. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus found Derek standing before the Institute's entrance, looking thoughtful. "Penny for your thoughts?" Marcus asked. Derek smiled. "Just thinking about that morning 7 years ago. If someone had told me then that we'd be here now, that my biggest mistake would become the foundation for all this, I wouldn't have believed them." "Life has a way of turning our worst moments into our greatest opportunities," Marcus replied. "The question is whether we're brave enough to seize them." Inside the Institute, the first class of recruits from departments nationwide prepared for training. On the wall hung a simple plaque, "From a wrongful arrest to rightful reform, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and sometimes that step is backward before we can move forward." As night fell over Boston, the city settled into its routine. Officers patrolled streets where trust had replaced fear, where community and police worked as partners rather than adversaries. It wasn't perfect, no human system ever is, but it was better, demonstrably better, than what had come before. In her patrol car, Sergeant Santos responded to a call about a suspicious person. As she approached the scene, she smiled, remembering her first such call 5 years earlier. The Boston model had become second nature, as automatic as breathing. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, approaching the scene, beginning community engagement protocol." The radio crackled back. "Copy that, Unit 12, body camera activated. Proceed with standard Boston model approach." Standard. The word carried so much weight. What had once been revolutionary was now routine. What had begun with an unjust arrest had become justice itself, reformed and reforming, a system learning to see people as people first, problem second. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the principles they'd fought so hard to establish. But tonight, Boston slept peacefully, protected and served by officers who understood that their greatest weapon wasn't force, but trust. Their greatest strength not power, but partnership. The transformation was complete, yet always continuing. As Marcus had said, this wasn't the end of the journey, merely proof that the journey was worth taking. And in police departments across America, that journey was just beginning, inspired by a city that had turned its darkest moment into its brightest hope. 10 years. A decade since that cold November morning when Officer Derek Sullivan arrested Judge Marcus Thompson for being black in an affluent neighborhood. As Marcus stood before the mirror in his chambers, adjusting his robes for what would be his final day as Chief Judge of the Massachusetts Superior Court, he could hardly recognize the world that single moment had created. The morning sun streamed through his office windows, illuminating the walls covered with photographs, awards, and memorabilia from a journey that had transformed American policing. His eyes settled on a framed newspaper clipping. "Local arrest sparks national reform movement." Below it, a photo of him and Derek shaking hands at the first graduation ceremony of the Thompson-Sullivan Institute. A knock interrupted his reverie. Gladys Freeman entered, carrying a steaming cup of tea and wearing an expression somewhere between pride and melancholy. "Your last day," she said simply, setting the tea on his desk. "Hard to believe it's been 10 years. Marcus accepted the tea gratefully. Harder to believe what those 10 years have accomplished. "The car's waiting," Gladys continued. "They're all there already. Derek, Frank, Maria, Patricia. Even Officer Mitchell flew in from Seattle." The ceremony was being held at the site where it all began, the corner of Charles and Beacon. The city had transformed it into a small park, dubbed Reconciliation Square, with a modest monument commemorating the arrest that changed everything. As Marcus's car approached the square, he saw the crowd had grown far beyond the invited guests. Community members, police officers, civil rights leaders, even tourists drawn by the story. Hundreds of people gathered to mark this anniversary. Derek Sullivan stood near the monument, now chief of police, his once dark hair showing distinguished streaks of gray. Beside him, Frank Castellano, retired but still consulting on reform initiatives, chatted with Maria Santos, the newly appointed head of the Boston Police Academy. "There he is," Derek called out as Marcus emerged from the car. The crowd parted respectfully as the two men who had inadvertently sparked a revolution approached each other. They embraced, not as former adversary and victim, but as partners in transformation. The crowd applauded, many wiping away tears. "Ready for this?" Derek asked. "Are we ever?" Marcus replied with a smile. The ceremony began with Mayor Williams, the same official who had scrambled to manage the crisis 10 years ago, taking the podium. 10 years ago on this spot, an injustice occurred that could have been just another statistic, another story of bias and abuse of power. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most comprehensive police reform in American history. She gestured to the monument. a simple bronze sculpture depicting two figures, one in police uniform, one in a suit, facing each other in dialogue rather than confrontation. Today we celebrate not just the change that followed, but the courage it took to admit wrong, to learn, and to do better. We honor Judge Marcus Thompson and Chief Derek Sullivan, but also every officer, every community member, every citizen who chose progress over pride. Derek spoke next, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. 10 years ago, I made an assumption that could have destroyed a man's dignity, career, and faith in justice. Instead, that man chose to turn his experience into an opportunity for all of us to grow. Judge Thompson didn't just forgive, he led us toward something better. He paused, looking at the attending officers, many of whom had never known policing without the Boston model. To the new generation of officers here today, you inherit a tradition of service built on respect, accountability, and continuous improvement. Honor it, but never stop pushing it forward. Marcus took the podium last, the morning sun catching the silver in his hair. When Officer Sullivan arrested me, I had a choice. I could have pursued vengeance, could have used my position to punish. Instead, I chose to ask a question. How do we ensure this doesn't happen to others? He looked out at the crowd, recognizing faces old and new. The answer wasn't simple. It required all of us, police and community, judges and citizens, to confront uncomfortable truths and commit to difficult change. The Boston model isn't perfect. No human system ever is. But it represents something profound, the belief that we can always do better. As the formal ceremony concluded, the gathering transformed into something more organic, a community celebration. Food trucks appeared, local musicians began playing, and people mingled freely, officers in uniform chatting with residents, children playing tag around the monument. Patricia Martinez, now a captain in charge of community relations, found Marcus near the refreshment table. "You know, I never properly thanked you," she said. "That morning I tried to warn Derek, but I didn't push hard enough. Your response taught me that speaking up isn't enough. Sometimes you have to stand up." "We all learned that day," Marcus replied. "The question is what we do with those lessons." Across the park, Frank Castellano was deep in conversation with a group of young officers. His transformation from reform skeptic to advocate had become legendary within the department. "The hardest part," he was telling them, "was admitting that my instincts were often just prejudices in disguise. Chief Sullivan likes to say that the badge gives you authority but demands humility. Took me too long to understand that." Maria Santos approached Derek, who was watching the festivities with a satisfied expression. "Chief, remember my first day? That suspicious person call in this very neighborhood?" Derek chuckled. "David Mitchell, looking for his tutoring job. I remember." "He's at Harvard Law now," Maria revealed. "Wants to be a civil rights attorney. Says that interaction with me showed him what policing could be." As afternoon faded to evening, the crowd gradually thinned, but a core group remained. The original players in this decade-long drama. They gathered near the monument as the setting sun painted the sky in familiar shades of amber and gold. Officer Bill O'Brien, whose shooting incident had nearly derailed the reforms, spoke quietly. "I think about that day in Dorchester all the time. If these changes hadn't happened, I might have killed someone. The fear, the assumptions, they would have controlled me." Mitchell, the officer who had falsely arrested Jamal Reynolds, nodded in agreement. "I spent 20 years thinking I was a good cop. Turns out being good isn't enough. You have to be conscious, deliberate, always questioning your own biases." As darkness fell, the park's lights illuminated the monument and the inscription at its base. "Where justice stumbled, wisdom rose. Where assumptions divided, understanding united." From this spot, a city chose to change, and in changing showed a nation the way forward. Marcus and Derek stood together looking at those words. "Did you ever imagine it would go this far?" Derek asked. "Honestly? No," Marcus admitted. "I thought maybe we'd change a few policies, train a few officers differently. I never imagined police departments across the world would be studying what we did here." The Thompson-Sullivan Institute has trained over 50,000 officers from 6 continents, Derek mused. "Sometimes I get emails from places I can't even pronounce, asking for advice on implementing community policing. And yet," Marcus said softly, "we both know the work isn't finished." Derek nodded. "It never will be. That's what I tell every graduating class. Reform isn't a destination. It's a discipline." As the evening wound down, people began saying their goodbyes. Hugs were exchanged, promises made to stay in touch, plans laid for future collaborations. The Boston model had created not just new policing methods, but a community of reformers committed to continuous improvement. Marcus was among the last to leave. As he walked toward his car, he paused at the spot where, 10 years ago, he had stood in handcuffs. The physical space was the same, but everything else had transformed. His phone buzzed with a message from his successor, incoming Chief Judge Alicia Ramirez. "Big shoes to fill. Any final advice?" Marcus typed back, "Remember that justice isn't just about applying law. It's about understanding humanity. And sometimes our greatest opportunities for justice come disguised as our worst moments." As he drove home through the quiet streets of Boston, Marcus reflected on the journey. 10 years ago, these same streets had been patrolled by officers trained to see threats rather than people. Now, young officers like Maria Santos approached each interaction as an opportunity for connection rather than confrontation. At home, Marcus found his wife Denise waiting with dinner. She had witnessed every step of this journey, from that first angry phone call from the police station to tonight's triumphant celebration. "How was it?" she asked, though her knowing smile suggested she already knew. "Surreal," Marcus admitted. "To see how far we've come, but also to realize how much further we have to go." "That's the nature of progress," Denise said, squeezing his hand. "It's never finished, just continued." Later that night, unable to sleep, Marcus stood on his back porch looking out over the city. His phone chimed with a notification from the Thompson-Sullivan Institute's social media. A photo from today's ceremony had gone viral, showing him and Derek embracing at the monument. The comments were overwhelming. Testimonials from officers who had changed their approach, citizens who had experienced the new policing firsthand, even international law enforcement leaders citing the Boston model in their own reforms. One comment caught his eye, from a username he didn't recognize. "My dad is Officer Chen. After his excessive force case, I was so ashamed. But watching him go through the rehabilitation process, seeing him change and grow, now I'm proud. Next month, I start at the police academy. Because of what you all built, I believe in what policing can be." Marcus smiled, remembering Chen's journey from suspension to redemption to becoming one of the force's most effective community officers. Change was possible, one person at a time, one interaction at a time. His phone rang. Derek, also apparently unable to sleep. "Couldn't wind down either." Derek's voice was warm with understanding. "Too much to process," Marcus admitted. 10 years, Derek. 10 years since you put those handcuffs on me." "Best mistake I ever made," Derek chuckled, "though I wouldn't recommend it as a career strategy." They talked for an hour, reminiscing about the journey, the resistance they'd faced, the victories they'd celebrated, the lives that had been changed. As they spoke, Marcus received a text from Patricia Martinez, a photo of tomorrow's Boston Globe front page. The headline read, "A Decade of Change, How One Arrest Transformed American Policing." Below it, a subtitle, Thompson retires as chief judge, leaves legacy of reform. "You see the globe?" Marcus asked Derek. "Just got it. Nice photo of us, though I think I had less gray hair 10 years ago." "We both did," Marcus laughed. "But I'll take the gray hair if it comes with the wisdom we've gained." As they said their goodnights, Marcus felt a deep sense of completion. Not ending, but fulfillment. Tomorrow he would wake up as a private citizen for the first time in decades. But the work would continue. The Thompson-Sullivan Institute would keep training officers. The Boston model would keep evolving. And somewhere on some street corner, a police officer would approach a citizen with respect rather than suspicion, understanding rather than assumption. The last thing Marcus did before heading to bed was send a message to the Institute's current graduating class. "You inherit a proud tradition, but tradition without evolution is just repetition. Keep questioning, keep learning, keep improving. The badge you wear represents not just authority, but the ongoing promise to do better. Honor that promise, and you honor everyone who fought to make it possible." As he finally drifted off to sleep, Marcus thought about that cold November morning 10 years ago. He had been arrested for being black in the wrong neighborhood. Now, thanks to that arrest and everything that followed, there were fewer wrong neighborhoods, fewer wrongful assumptions, fewer barriers between police and the communities they served. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was better. Measurably, demonstrably better. And in the delicate balance between law and justice, better was worth every gray hair, every difficult conversation, every moment of doubt and determination. The story of that morning on Beacon Street would continue to be told in police academies, community centers, and courtrooms around the world. Not as a tale of shame, but as proof that from our worst moments can come our greatest growth. That courage isn't the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to learn from them. That true justice begins when we see each other not as stereotypes or statistics, but as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. In the end, that was the real legacy of that November morning. The simple, powerful truth that change is possible when good people choose understanding over assumption, progress over pride, and justice over just getting by.